Good afternoon, all of you. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today on this webinar. This webinar is again done jointly by QED and RIMA One, and it's the second webinar in our series on the AACSB 2020 standards. Last week, Frank and Joanne gave you a general overview of the new 2020 standards and what those the changes in the standards mean for you. And today we will focus on Standard 3, which is on faculty and professional staff resources. Key standard for AACSB, one that is very data heavy, that has all your faculty qualifications and your ratios. So great to have two true experts on here. Joanne, that you already know from last week, who's with QED, and then Sarah Vaughan, who's Associate Dean Accreditations at ICN Business School. So great to have you both. Again, as last week, we'll try to make the session as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A to raise them. If there are urgent questions, we'll try to squeeze them in, but most of them we'll try to answer towards the end when we do our Q&A. And today there's also a second element to make this a bit more interactive, and those are some polls. So don't go away too far from your screens. Don't eat with both hands too much at the same time at the moment. Be ready to hit your answers in the poll. They'll come up once Joanne starts talking about the standards, 4 in total. So be ready, and we're curious to see how you answer those. So that's a brief introduction. I'm happy to hand it over to Joanne and enjoy this webinar today.
Thank you so much, Axel. That's great. And we probably should add that Axel is stepping in for Ben today.
Yes, I was prepared to pull a joke on this, but I refrained from it. So,
so we won't make any comments about Ben's ability then, one way or the other. Okay, so thanks. So before we get into the detail of faculty and Standard 3, just a quick reminder of some of the key facts from last week by way of introduction. So as we said last week, the standards are now grouped into 3 sections. So section 1 focuses on strategic management and innovation. Section 2 is learner success. And the third area is around thought leadership, engagement and societal impact. And really the area around faculty and professional staff resources sits firmly within the first group. So this is all part of AACSB's efforts to simplify and reduce duplication within the 2020 standards. So if you look at Standard 1 on strategic planning, as we said last week, this really focuses in on what's the mission and the strategy of the school. And then Standards 2 and 3, 2 around physical, virtual, financial resources, and 3 around faculty and staffing, professional staffing. It's really about, do you have the right resources in place to actually support your mission and support your key objectives? The other thing I'll mention quickly is that Standard 3, which we're dealing with today, focuses, in terms of 2013, it brings together Standards 5, 6, 7, and 15. So Standard 5, if you remember, is faculty sufficiency. Standard 6 around faculty development. Standard 7 around professional staffing. And Standard 15 around faculty qualifications. Now we'll focus mostly around the kind of faculty sufficiency and qualifications today, particularly the topic of discipline. The other key things that we mentioned was, and these principles stand true within this standard as well as overall, is the kind of key accreditation principles. So last week we talked about the journey matters. So within AACSB, business schools are asked to hold themselves accountable. So it continues to be a system for continuous improvement, for improving business practice. And every school has its own journey and has to hold itself accountable based on that journey. So in the context of Standard 3, this really talks about, how are your staffing resources changing? Where were your staffing resources at? Where are they? What's in place now? And what's your plan going forward for your staffing resources? And it's looking for your strategic trajectory in terms of this. When we talk about the second principle around the triangle of excellence, what we're talking about here is the intersection between academic and professional engagement, and using that within the school to drive excellence in line with mission. So in terms of staffing here, we're saying, how are you deploying your faculty and professional staff to drive clear interconnections between degree programs, practice, and intellectual contributions. And again, this is again talking about strategic deployment, strategic connections, not ad hoc. And then finally, of course, everything connects. So everything comes back to mission and strategy. And again, for those who maybe are new to AACSB, when we talk about mission, we're talking about vision, mission, core values, and key strategic objectives. So everything comes back. So in terms of standard 3, you're saying, is your staffing sufficient and appropriate to support your mission and key strategic objectives? And that really is all about what standard 3 is about. We talked last week about a general overview of the changes with AACSB, and you'll hear me talking again today about the principles-based framework, but it's fair to say that mostly we'll be focusing in on the unit of faculty reporting, and that'll come up several times today, as you'll see, and you'll get a chance to have a try of that and ask some questions. So we said we'd cover the key differences, the similarities first. So before we hit the differences, the similarities. So the first thing I would say is that there's no changes in expectation for the overall support and development of staff, whether you're talking about professional staff or faculty. That remains the same between 2013 and 2020. There have been some clarifications of previous positions, and in relation to standard 3, the most obvious one would be around the academic requirements for SA and PA categories for faculty. So under 2013 standards, ACSB expected that you would have a doctoral and usually a PhD qualification as a kind of minimum academic requirement for anybody falling into scholarly academic or practice academic categories. Now, under the 2020 standards, they've clarified that this is a terminal degree is the requirement, and that terminal degree therefore will include things like a DBA, an EdD, LLM, and other areas like that. Now, I think a lot of schools were already doing that in practice under the 2013 standards, but it wasn't completely clear. And that's one of the areas that ACSB has clarified. And then finally, I would say around the data requirements, the level of data that we traditionally understood as required under 2013 to the likes of table 15.1 and 15.2 are broadly similar. So the level and the depth of data is similar, but there are nuances, and that comes through to where the changes are coming in. So that's a particularly key point. So in terms of changes, I'm going to refer to 3 changes here, and we're going to go into a bit more detail on 2 of them. So the change causing the most discussion really relates to the unit of faculty grouping. So as we covered last week, under 2013 standards, the unit of faculty grouping was determined by the school, and it depended on what made sense in terms of the administrative or operational structures within schools. So for example, many schools that QED has worked with use departmental headings. Others use subject groupings, and there were even some small schools that just grouped all of their faculty together under one heading. Under the 2020 standards, schools are required to report on the tables by discipline. Now we're talking today all about standard 3 and the faculty tables, but this discipline structure also applies to your research tables when you look at standard 8. And we're going to talk a lot more about discipline and what this means in a moment. The second change is around terminology, and the biggest one and the most obvious one in terms of standard 3 is around other versus additional. So under the 2013 standards, anybody who didn't fit into your faculty qualification categories of scholarly academic, practice academic, scholarly practitioner, and instructional practitioner was categorized as other faculty. Under the 2020, that hasn't changed at all, other than they're now referred to as additional faculty. So it is purely a change in description, but nothing to do with how they're categorized there has changed. And then finally, under the 2013 standards, AACSB would have had specific requirements for the deployment of faculty at both the overall or macro level and at what I would call the sub-level or the micro levels. So simply put, in 2013, schools were expected to meet faculty criteria, whether it's qualification or sufficiency, not just at the school level or departmental level, but also for every program, every mode, every location. The faculty requirements were quite prescriptive. And I mean, there was scope to argue the merits of non-alignments and to have some areas that didn't quite align. But it's probably fair to say that the focus was very much a compliance focus. So under the 2020 standards, you now have a lot more discretion in those areas. But again, that discretion brings a level of responsibility. And we're going to again come back to that as we go through this. So let's look at discipline. So every school has to decide on the disciplines it's going to use. We've said that you have to report by discipline. So the first question for every school is to look at what those disciplines might be. And this is an area where there is choice that can vary from school to school. So there are a few key questions that you want to ask yourselves. So the first key question is, does the business school offer, in what subjects does my business school offer business degree programs or majors? So essentially, ACSB wants to know, what are the disciplines that drive the degrees or majors offered in your school? And what kind of intellectual capital does the school have to support those degrees? So, for example, if a school was offering a degree in something like accounting, then you would expect to see the discipline of accounting. Likewise, if there's a bachelor in marketing, you'd expect to see a discipline in marketing. If there's a master's in management, you expect to see a discipline of management. But there are a few things to be really careful about. ACSB has clearly stated that disciplines should be compiled at the macro level. So what this means is that it's possible to group subjects together within a single discipline. So the most obvious one is probably the management discipline. Within the broad discipline of management, you could have things like strategy, human resources, general management studies, entrepreneurship, etc. So that's where the discretion starts to arise. The schools have to decide for themselves how they're going to group subjects into a discipline at a macro level. And one of the examples I often use is, if you think of something like entrepreneurship, a school might have a degree in entrepreneurship, and it might decide that it's going to place entrepreneurship within the wider discipline of management. Nothing wrong with that decision whatsoever. However, if that same school had a real focus on entrepreneurship, like if the school's mission made particular reference to it, if it was a very large part of the strategic plan of the school, if it's something that was a very strong research area, then you might decide that actually entrepreneurship is so strong that you'd expect to see it as a separate discipline. And in that case, the school might choose to separate it out into its own discipline area. The important point here is that there's no single right answer. Every school needs to define the disciplines in line with their own degree programs and their own mission focus. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to drop in and we're just going to do a couple of examples through polls. So the first poll, we're going to say, let's take an example where a school offers a bachelor's degree in accounting and finance. What might the discipline be for the purpose of ACSB reporting? So we'll just give you 30 seconds here. So answer A, each of accounting and finance, so 2 disciplines. Answer B, accounting and finance combined. And then answer C is either A or B could be correct. So Axel, I'm going to ask you just to throw up the results whenever you've given it a few seconds and you think most people have answered.
Yes, the answers are coming in. So I think the pre-warning at the beginning worked to keep people ready to vote. We give it a few more seconds. The majority has already casted their vote.
So we encourage everybody, nobody knows what you're voting, so give it a shot.
Only I do, but I won't give it away.
Okay, I can't see
I'm joking, I'm joking.
So I'll get you to throw up the results when you're ready, Axel.
I think we are done now, so let's end the poll. And I'm going to share the results with you now.
Okay, so 62% went for either A or B could be correct. 18% went for each of accounting and finance, and 20% went for combined. Perfect. Okay. So the answer is that either A or B could be correct. So what we're saying here is that none of the answers are actually wrong. It really depends on the school. If the school is offering a combined degree, you can combine the discipline. So if you are offering, for example, let's say it was a very small school, 1 degree in accounting and finance, then you could have accounting and finance as a combined discipline. However, if the school also offered separate degrees or very strong areas of concentration in accounting or finance, for example, maybe they offer also a master's in accounting or a bachelor's degree in finance, then you would split the disciplines and treat them separately. So again, you'll see it comes back to what's being done in the school and how the school operates.
Could I just add something,
Yes,
Joanne? I would also, because either any of those would work, as you rightly said. I think if I were a reviewer, if I had grouped the two together, I would want to take a look at your faculty's research outputs, because the underlying question is, have you got effective research in the areas you're teaching in? So you may just have one finance department, you may have grouped them together, but I would want to see who in that department or in that discipline area is publishing in accounting related topics and who's publishing, particularly if we have both in the degree program.
Thanks, Sarah, that's great. Okay, let's take a second one. So this is a slightly different one. So if a school offers a master's in human resources, what do you think the discipline might be for the purposes of AACSB? So again, we've given you 3 choices: human resources, management, or either A or B could be correct.
And it looks like our participants are eager to answer. The numbers are rising quickly. And we'll give you a few more seconds to think about it if you need to.
I can't see the answers coming in. I suspect I know where the concentration is going to be, and I'm curious to see if I'm right.
You want to bet on it?
I don't want to prejudge the answers.
Well, we have 86% who have casted their vote already. So
I would say the vast majority is in C, would be my guess. But let's see.
So this is where we'll go to the break, and we'll be back after the results.
Okay, let's throw up the results.
Exactly. They are coming in right now.
So 61% for either A or B, 27% went for human resources, and 13% went for management. Okay, fully understand where those answers are coming from. So let's just take a look. So again, either A or B could be correct. So let's go back to the point that we said earlier. AACSB is encouraging schools to consider disciplines at the macro level. So in theory, you can place HR under the broader discipline of management. AACSB is not looking to make this more difficult for schools. They've said that openly in the conferences and the various webinars that they've run. They're saying, you know, if it suits you to group areas together under a single discipline, that's quite okay. So you could put HR under the broader discipline of management. However, back to the example I had when I was speaking earlier about entrepreneurship. If the school had a significant reputation around HR, if it was an area of strategic focus, a key area of research, a really vital part of what the school is about, then it might be appropriate to have it within its own discipline. So again, we're back to this concept that the standards are principles-based. So schools have discretion and flexibility. The important thing is that your identified disciplines reflect the areas where you're expected to have intellectual capital, but keep it at a macro level. Don't make things any more complicated than they need to be, but be sure that what your disciplines are appropriate for where your intellectual capital should be based on the degrees you're offering, the research you're doing, etc.
Joanne, if I may briefly step in, because we have a question that directly is a follow-up question to what we're talking about right now from Oskari. And the question is, so if the school offers a degree in finance and a separate degree in accounting, they cannot be both grouped under the discipline of accounting and finance.
Absolutely correct. If there's a separate degree, then they need to be separate disciplines, because accounting and finance wouldn't necessarily be grouped together under a broader heading. They're very different subject areas. So that would be the subject of, that would be then the discipline of accounting and the discipline of finance. And you would expect to look at both of those individually. Sarah, do you want to add anything to that answer?
No, I think that's exactly the case. And as you rightly said, the first place it's all about the underlying principles of all of the standards of the notion of fostering quality and consistency. So we're going to be looking at mission, but there's also the dimension of validation, taking a look at what are your peer institutions doing. And I think it's important, with the Masters in Human Resources Management, if I was looking at the context of my school where we have an MSc in HR, then we would have made the choice to flag it up separately, because we are communicating and driving a reputation on a particular specialist degree program. So take a look, it's about your mission, but take a look also at peer institutions, and there are fabulous resources within the AACSB network to see what's going on.
We have one more follow-up question on this that actually made me smile a bit. It came in anonymous. Well, it's a good one.
They always ask the good questions, anonymous, always.
So, ready?
Yeah, go for it.
If you have a degree in finance, one in accounting, and then a master's in accounting and finance, what then?
Separate disciplines.
Separate disciplines.
Yeah, because you have individual degrees in each one. So it's separate disciplines.
Okay.
Yeah. And then faculty time would be dispatched across the degree programs, as is already the case.
Yeah.
And we have one last one that goes in the same direction. I think then I think we can keep it on this. So if we have a BBA in management and another one in service management, do we need to have two different disciplines, or can we combine management and service management into just service management?
Now I'll let Sarah answer as well. My gut instinct would be that both of those would probably fall under the broad area of management studies.
Yeah, I would take a look, actually, because be careful. We confuse sometimes the commercialization of a program and therefore the title that we've given to the degree and content. If you flag up the ingredients of a Mars bar, nobody would recognize it, because that's not what we buy when we buy the brand. So I would go and take a look at the program, actually, and see what is the percentage that radically would sit outside management in a specific area of services. At an undergraduate level, my gut feeling is that is actually less than the title would lead us to believe. But again, I would look at that, and that would help me also to guide my decisions.
And actually, I'm going to add just a little bit of extra alongside of this, and it's an area Sarah and I have talked about before. When we're talking about this first key question, and we're talking very much about degree programs, subjects that are attached to, that are driving degree programs, where AACSB also says concentrations are majors. And I think particularly in the European system, quite often you would see something that might be called a concentration, because there's a very minor part of the degree that's allocated to it. So it's I think Sarah's described it before as the cherry on top kind of thing. Yeah. So if you're driving, for example, a master's in management with a HR piece, but the HR piece is a very small amount of the credits that are allocated to the area, and it's the cherry on top, then I wouldn't see that as being a major or a concentration in the way AACSB means it. It's only areas that have got a very high significance within the program. And really that comes in, particularly when you've got a program like a general MBA or a general master's in management, that you just need to look under the hood. As Sarah's just said, you need to look at the subjects that are driving that degree, and then look at what your discipline should be based on that.
No, I promise I wouldn't throw in any more questions at you at this point, but actually we just received one from Ruth that I think sort of summarizes this perfectly, what you've just been saying. And what she's worried about is it not harder at the undergraduate level to name disciplines? Because many modules involved crossing many areas, or do you have to calculate what the majority module teaching discipline is in, or how do you do it?
Sarah, do you want to take that one first?
I would, yeah. Firstly, I'd say to Ruth, yes, it's true that at undergraduate level, the degrees tend to be generalist business degrees. You'll have pretty much all the functional areas of business represented in equal levels of credits, with a specialization track. I mean, sometimes we use these words, and as Joanne rightly said, when you take a look at it, it's 20 credits of a 180 credit degree. And so it really is, if we go to the ingredients and the design. So no, I think it's a question of, and we're always, whether we were in the 2013 standards or the 2003, it's incumbent to the school to demonstrate that they have appropriate levels of teaching and research in given areas, and they have the resources to do it well. And that means a very different balance from one area to another in terms of academic or professional engagement. So I wouldn't go slicing and dicing. Be careful of going too thin. You know, to quote an ex-German colleague who used to say, well, how thin can the soup get and still be called soup? So be careful that you're bringing meaningful together. Your faculty's research is a fabulous, fabulous way of doing it. There are other ways, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So I would tend to agree, unless you're in a specialist degree like hospitality and tourism management, which in some schools falls below the 25% of business disciplines in the degree anyway. I think you're very much across the broad functional areas of business in a very broad macro sense of the term.
I will just say to Ruth and those who are thinking along these to hold fire, because there is another layer to this that we're going to come to in a couple of moments, which may go part of the way towards answering that particular piece as well. So don't dial off just yet. You might want to revisit this at the end. Okay, so that takes that one. We'll move on then. Our final, well, we'll have another poll shortly, but our final poll in this section, just a little cheeky one. So if a school provides a bachelor's in international business with French or Chinese or German or whatever foreign language you want to substitute there, should the faculty from the language program be included for AACSB reporting purposes? So just a little cheeky additional question there. And go back to basic principles. That's all I'll say. If anybody watches the Great British Bake Off, it's a bit like the technical challenge. You get one little hint. So this is go back to principles.
Do you want to cast a prediction again of how this?
No, I'm not casting any prediction on this one.
Okay, so about 2/3 of our participants have already answered.
You've got a 50-50 chance of being correct, let's face it.
Yep, we're increasing the odds.
Yes, odds are increasing for this one. Okay, let's.
So I think we're going to close the poll now and bring in the results for you. There you go.
Good. Almost 70% said no, and no is the correct answer. So again, just going back to basic principles, it was a bit of a trick question just to remind you about basic principles. Language is generally not considered to be a business course, and the faculty delivering the language 9 times out of 10 or 99 out of 100 tend to come from the language departments within the school. So therefore, that doesn't fall within scope for your tables. Now, there is the odd exception that can break the rule, but by and large, for the vast majority of schools, if your faculty is coming from a completely separate school that is outside and it's not a business subject as well, then you're not going to be including them on the tables. And languages generally 99.9% of the time would not be considered one of your business topics and business subjects. And AACSB is always focused on the faculty members who support the development of business and management.
Exactly. And I think this is a great example is that, and it's unfortunate with the semantics, we talk about new standards, it's continuous improvement.
Yes,
these are standards building on and improving on existing. So don't throw everything that you've been working on and all your reflexes of the past out of the window. This is continuous improvement rather than areas of substantive change. As we saw, there are more similarities than more refined definitions.
Yeah, and the basic principles remain in place. They haven't changed. Those key principles have not changed.
No.
Now, I'm going to keep going back to the initial question here. So this slide only refers to areas where the discipline reflects an area where the school offers degree programs or areas of very clear focus, as in major concentrations. Okay, so and I'm making that statement very clearly, and you'll see why in about 2 or 3 slides time. So if the discipline reflects an area where the school offers degree programs or areas of your major concentration, then your requirements are as follows. From a sufficiency perspective, AACSB expects that 60% of the teaching is undertaken by participating faculty. That has not changed from the 2013 standards. And there still remains the 75% overall at school level. So 60% sufficiency. Sorry, sufficiency, yeah. From a qualification perspective, AC would expect that at least 40% of the intellectual capital for the discipline is supported by scholarly academic faculty. Now, not SA and PA, scholarly academic faculty. So faculty with a focus on scholarly intellectual contribution. And again, this hasn't changed from the 2013 standards. And also a reminder that that 40% SA was and is a minimum guideline. So for example, if your school has got a very strong graduate degree focus or a strong research mission, then you would probably expect to see a higher proportion of SA within that particular discipline. And the other one I'll just mention here as well, that if the school, there's another tweak to that, that if the school makes appointments to drive new areas or areas of particular innovation, they do appreciate that it may not be appropriate or possible to reach the 40% SA ratio initially. And that was something that came in under the later versions of the 2013 standards and remains under 2020. And finally, you're not supposed to have any more than, or not expected to have any more than 10% of additional faculty. So in other words, 90% of your faculty plus must fall into scholarly academic, practice academic, scholarly practitioner, and instructional practitioner. So those remain. What is gone from here is that there's no 60% requirement. So with the 2013 standards, there was a 60% requirement for a combination of SA, PA, and SP. That no longer exists. And again, all of this is at the discipline level and the overall school level. And we're going to come on to deployment by program and location separately. But right now we're only talking about at the discipline level, and we're only talking about where the disciplines are driving subjects that are within degree programs or majors. So let's move it on and get let's just start adding the layers. I said there was two key questions. The second key question is, and this goes back to something that Ruth, I think, asked about. Are there business courses that do not reflect subjects in which degrees are offered? So what we're talking about here is what might be called supporting courses or very general courses. And one of the examples I often give is taxation. We've often worked in schools where you would see taxation offered as a module or a course within several degree programs within a business school, but it's not offered as a degree program or a serious major or concentration in its own right. It's more like an introduction to taxation or a general taxation or insights into taxation, a relatively high level module or course that's offered. In this case, AACSB says, well, we want to know what is the intellectual capital that's supporting that area. So it wants it to be given as a discipline. However, what's important to say is that the requirements are a little different. So if your discipline only reflects supporting courses, as opposed to reflecting something that's driving a degree program or a concentration, the first thing is sufficiency stays the same. AACSB still requires that 60% of teaching within that discipline, even if it's a supporting program, is driven by participating faculty. That hasn't changed. That's come up as a question in some of the conferences and sessions I've been at, and they've clarified that they've talked about this, and they've confirmed that they're sticking to that sufficiency requirement at the discipline level, regardless of whether the discipline is driving a degree program or driving a supporting program, a supporting course or module. When it comes to faculty qualification, it's still saying that you must have 90% plus of the faculty that are teaching sitting at SA, PA, SP, or IP. So no more than 10% of additional faculty. So that remains the same, regardless of whether your discipline is driving a degree program or whether it's driving a supporting course or module. However, there is no requirement to have a 40% SA requirement in this case. So if your discipline is driving supporting courses only and not driving an overall degree or discipline, then AACSB is not looking for you to reach the 40% SA, because it recognizes that faculty that are supporting those disciplines are probably also supporting other degree programs. So there's a little bit of just give and take there and a bit of flexibility. Now that's an important one to get your head around, and that's why we say it's important when it comes to disciplines to really think about what are your disciplines. First and foremostly, what are the subjects that are driving degree programs, because they automatically become disciplines, whether you group them together under one broad discipline or whether you separate them out. And then what are the supporting disciplines that are in place? And you have to look at both of those separately. And when it comes to the tables, you'll differentiate between what I would call the big disciplines that are driving degree programs and the disciplines that are driving or supporting your supporting programs. I could see that there's questions flashing up by the new time, but what I'm going to do is just do our final poll first. So in this one, I'm going to say, if a business school provides a course on introduction to corporate law, and it provides that to several of its degree programs, but it doesn't offer any overall degree in corporate law or business law degree, what might the discipline be for AACSB reporting purposes? Is it law? Is it not applicable? Or are we back to A or B, depending on your school?
While the poll results come in, do you think it might be a good idea to have a quick look at two of the questions that came in? Because I think they're sort of, again, sort of clarification questions to what has been said. And Malin is asking, what about transferable courses? Are these supporting?
Could we have an idea, what is a transferable course?
Yeah.
As a jargon I'm not familiar with. What are we talking about? Are we talking about foundation modules that are cross degrees? If I take examples of some countries that I've seen, there is a basic set of 6 modules which must be present in every degree program, whatever the track, whatever the specialization. Is this what Melling's referring to? Could you flag something up quickly, Melling? Courses in law that are elective.
Yeah.
We're in the same question. We'll see what the poll says.
Yes, that's going to be the same answer as the poll, basically.
Yep.
Okay, then maybe we'll finish the poll here, quickly get back to this, and then we have 2 more questions that maybe we can answer at this stage. So let's share the results of this one. Okay.
So not applicable, there's no reporting requirement. 13 say that there is, and 31% going for A or B. Perfect. Okay. So again, this is one that is a real gray area. So that's why we wanted to bring it in. And strictly speaking, it's A or B. It depends who's teaching the course and whether they're part of the overall business school faculty or part of a completely separate school. And again, it's always a gray area one. AACSB states that if courses are serviced from outside of the business school completely, so sometimes you would get statistics courses that are serviced from a maths department. You would get law courses that are serviced from a completely separate school of law. You could have an economics course that is serviced by a completely separate school of economics. And generally speaking, the rule is if it's serviced from outside of the business school completely, then the discipline is not required. It's a bit like the languages one.
Yeah.
However, areas like, law, statistics, economics, it's always going to be a gray area. It's always one that you should discuss with your mentor, with your AACSB liaison, with your external advisor, because it's just the nuance. You've got to stand back and look, what is the reality of the situation?
Exactly. I think that's a very confusing one for those of you who are in countries, as we are in France, where we're standalone institutions, because by definition, everyone is a member of the business school faculty. But some of those modules may be belonging to what I would consider to be tools or gen ed. Some schools in that system will declare law, and there may be a very strong reason for it. If I take the example of my school, we do use law. We put it in as a supporting module, but for one reason is that we have a double degree, a hybrid program with the Faculty of Law, and those modules count towards a subsequent double degree arrangement, one in general management and one in law. So we want to show, it's because it's a strong part of our story, that we're doing something, and also to identify the type of faculty we want in that classroom. And this is where the notion of ratios. I think one of the fabulous things in the 2020 standards is that we're going to sit down and have real conversations about what do we want the faculty to look like. I think there were so many ratios that people were talking about ratios. And yet if you speak out loud and say we want thought leadership and practice leadership, we will create it, and our mission is to serve this particular purpose, we start talking more clearly. And it's evident in my business school setting that our law faculty, because it's introduction to business law across all our degree programs, we want practicing lawyers and solicitors. We don't want academics, whereas the university law degree will have a far more academic component. So depends very much on your mission and what you want to flag up about how your school is unique in its mission and purpose.
And I think we can't emphasize that enough. This idea that there is an element of discretion, there is an element of subjectivity. It comes back to the professional framework, which we're going to talk about or reference again very quickly later. The other thing I'll just mention here is that some of you may have caught it, but Stephanie Bryant, who's the Chief Accreditations Officer with AACSB, has started doing a tips and trends video on YouTube, which is issued every week. There was one issued last week, and actually she dealt with a question very similar to this in last week. Each video is 2 or 3 minutes long, and it is designed to respond to questions that she's getting live through emails or through conferences. If anybody hasn't seen that, it's definitely worth flagging into. If you need the link, contact any of us afterwards and we can send you on the link. I'm going to move on because I'm conscious of time, and I know that we'll have a lot more questions, but let's just get through the rest of this. So we said that the discipline, and we said up to now that we were talking about deployment at the discipline level. So what happens when it comes to deployment by location or by program? So the bottom line is, we said schools have flexibility to determine the appropriate deployment of faculty once they've met the relevant ratios at discipline and school level. And as we said, those ratios might be slightly different depending on whether the discipline is driving a degree program or area of focus, or whether it's a more supporting area. Now, this is where we need to make some really good key points. This might appear easier, and it might be easier, but the issue here is that it's more flexible, not easier. Schools are still expected to staff programs appropriately and staff locations appropriately in order to support mission objectives and support the key, good quality learning outcomes. AACSB and the peer review teams are still likely to ask for an analysis by program, by location, by mode, because they're going to want to explore how the school has decided to deploy its faculty resources. So the first point is you still have to prepare those analyses. So you still need to have a good data system that's going to facilitate you to prepare those analyses. Once you prepare them, then you need to demonstrate strategic deployment decisions, not ad hoc allocation of faculty. So very typical example, you've got an outreach program 3 continents away. You're going to use local faculty because it's handier and they all fall into IP and additional. And you just decide to go with that because it's convenient. It makes, commercial sense. You're reasonably happy that they're okay. You're in good contact. Now, that might well be an appropriate decision and appropriate strategic deployment, but AACSB would be very likely to query how that decision supports quality outcomes. And as a school, you would be expected to demonstrate the quality outcomes, whether you use AOL or something similar. And you've got to be able to explain why that deployment decision is suitable and similar and gives the students in those areas an equivalent experience to the students in any other location or in any other program. So principles-based again means, yes, there's more flexibility, but there's also more gray areas and more subjectivity. And last week I talked about AACSB's professional judgment framework, which reviewers are being asked to follow a 4-step process for evaluate, ask, confer, and make. So what I would expect if I was on a review team, and I'm sure Sarah would add to that, because she's often been mentored and taken part in various reviews, would be they'll evaluate the tables that you present to them. And then they will ask the question. So if you've got lots of degrees or different modes, whether it's online, blended, face-to-face, programs in multiple locations, dual degrees, they're going to ask, what is the deployment of faculty in those locations, programs, and modes? And then they're going to ask you, how does that deployment drive quality outcomes? And how is that deployment in line with your strategy and your mission? And as a school, you have a responsibility to be able to robustly defend those decisions based on evidence of quality outcomes. So there's the flexibility is there, but that brings a responsibility to schools. Sarah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Completely, and very often you would also get the question of, for example, did you separate human resources and management, or did you put them together? Not only to justify that you've got them together, if that was your choice, but why you didn't go down the other avenue. The question isn't always, will push you. And I think what's really interesting around this discipline is it's driving conversations in our schools about, you know, the underlying question has always been, what would success look like? What makes sense?
Yeah.
What fits your mission? Where do you want to be going? It's also a journey. Our quality is not a destination, it's a journey. So where do you want to be going? And if today this is the way you've deployed it, is that success? Or is there going to be another step, and why? So I think it's really driving conversations and taking the focus away. The notion of quality, simplification doesn't mean a change of quality. And it goes away from the notion of complying, okay, we've got 40, that's fine. Or we've got 60, that's fine. Because it's not just about ratios. The ratio is the translation of a strategy and a policy.
Yeah. Very quickly, just to finish up, and then we'll take the rest of the questions, or as many as we can get through in the time. So the key points I would say to take away from here is, remember, first of all, we've talked a lot about faculty now, but remember Standard 3 refers to all staffing resources and the deployment of all staffing resources. So it's not just faculty, and it needs to support your mission and your mission and what you're driving towards. Discipline is key. So one of the things we would say is you need to review your programs, your courses, and your mission, and work out what are the appropriate disciplines for your school. And again, there isn't a right and wrong answer. And even when you're queried or pushed by a mentor or a review team or somebody else, that doesn't mean your answer is wrong. It just means that you need to work harder to explain why that's the correct answer. You can expect to be challenged. So you need to be ready for that challenge. As we said, you know, flexibility brings subjectivity. So you need to demonstrate those high quality outcomes. And finally, as we said last week, make use of available supports. Now, those supports come in every shape and form. They come in the shape of, first of all, the standards themselves. Remember the interpretive guidance. For those of you who weren't on the webinar last week, that's an accompanying document that AACSB has provided to the standards. And it is absolutely vital in terms of getting additional explanation, clarifications, examples, etc. It's got a green cover, whereas the standards have a white cover. So that's one to watch out for. Watch out for conference sessions, webinars, whether it's these webinars. AACSB is also running a series of webinars in November, which are also free. So you should log into those if you get a chance, or at least register to get the recording. You've obviously got your AACSB staff liaison, always available, the mentors, the peer review chairs, the other volunteers, and obviously external advisors. And the last thing I would say is to remember, everybody is learning. Currently, AACSB is going through the pilot phase with the standards, with the schools that are having peer review visits, or with a small group of those schools. And there's bound to be clarifications and, you know, additional information that arises from that. So everybody in the process is learning. So I think we all need to be just very conscious of that and stay in touch, take our own responsibility to just stay in touch with what becomes available and the different clarifications and messages that get sent out. Right, Axel, back to you for the rest of the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joanne and Sarah. I think that's been some very great insights, and I hope the others feel as blessed as I did, leveraging your expertise on this. Now, we've received plenty of questions, some of which I hope have become clearer as you've summed up what we've talked about, as there were a lot of very hands-on examples, I think, from people's own schools in the differentiation of disciplines and degrees, etc. But let me focus on a few, I think, that we have not touched upon so far. And there's the question from Umid asking, when we consider the programs, is it degree programs only or certification and diploma programs as well? So terms of executive education, for instance?
Okay, that's a great question. So when it comes to reporting faculty by discipline, you're really focusing particularly on your degree programs and the subjects that drive those degree programs. There is the area of micro-learning credentials, where areas that you might traditionally have an executive ed can stack up and become a degree. If something can become a degree program, then you should include it in the mix when you're looking at disciplines. But if it's purely executive education with no micro-learning stackable credential kind of connotation, then you don't need to consider it strictly in this way. Sarah, do you want to add to that? Or?
No, fully agree. And I think with executive education, non-degree education, it's always been the case. It's about explaining what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're controlling those quality outcomes. The notion of diversity in the client portfolio, in the programs that you're designing here, are inherent and one of the underlying principles of the standards anyway. So, no, I agree.
And we pick up that point in our AOL seminar webinar next week as well.
Coming to this, I actually have a question that's going to spoil a bit in that direction. Before I ask it, as I was saying, as we had some questions with specific hands-on examples from your own schools, if you feel like they have not been fully covered in the webinar yet and you still need some clarification, please repost them in the chat or Q&A, or I will raise them again now. But coming to that spoiler question, and that's coming from Ruth, and she's wondering about the connection between disciplines and assurance of learning. Now, the question is, the reporting we're required to do in the area of assurance of learning, is that requirement also a focus that is needed in AUL for the disciplines?
To my mind, that's mixing metaphors. Assurance of learning is really about, are my degree programs delivering what I say they're delivering? So when I look at my overall kind of top level program learning outcomes or competencies within the 2020 framework of standards, or my overall school learning outcomes, are my programs delivering those the way I say? So AOL is all about assuring whether that's happening. They may or may not relate to your disciplines, but your disciplines again are going to be a tool to drive delivery of those. So I would say that's a little bit of mixed metaphors.
Yeah, fully agree. Fully agree. You're talking AOL is about the graduate attributes. So it's the promise you make, not only to the students in terms of return on investment, of what they will be able to do and what they'll look like at the end of a program, but it's also to the employment market. And it doesn't go into that level. We're looking at characteristics that together build up a framework of what those people look like. It's the to rather than going right down into the design.
We have a question from Angela that's basically a follow-up question to what Umid has been asking, and that is, what if the certificate is not part of executive education and is actually a standalone certificate?
When we talk about executive education in the context of AACSB or EFMD or AMBA, either for that matter, what we're talking about is anything that doesn't fit under degree programs. So there's always this thing, because quite often when you go into schools and they say, well, our MBA is part of our executive education because they have it structured that way within their school. We're not talking about executive education in terms of the way it's structured within a school. We're talking about executive education as something that's not
continuing education, non-degree.
Yeah, lifelong learning, it's non-degree. So it's not tied into your organizational structure as such. So the answer there would be, it's not relevant unless it's part of a degree.
Thank you. Then we have another anonymous question, and that's sort of, I think, going to be a nice summary again when we earlier spoke about the differentiation between disciplines and departments. And we have some examples here where the departments have names such as accounting and information management, marketing and supply chain management, micro and public economics, et cetera, et cetera. So are these still too broad to be considered disciplines?
And that's something we can't answer without looking, or neither can you, as in the person who asked the question or anybody else, without actually looking at what are the subjects that are driving the degree programs and supporting the degree programs. You could have whatever departmental structure you want, because every school is going to do what suits them from an administrative purpose. But when it comes to reporting,
yeah, I think one of the things, there's a global trend, having done a study on faculty organizations and governance in a number of schools in 13 countries a couple of years ago. There's a worldwide movement to reduce the number of academic departments because you're giving teaching release. It could impact research trajectories. So we're grouping many disciplines together. If I take the example of my school, I've got supply chain, information system, and quantitative stuff. Those are very different disciplines. So imagine in the 2013 standards, I could have reported that as one area. It's not. My information systems people don't look anything like the supply chain people. Their research is not in the same outlets, and the nature of the learning is very different. So I think it's really so that we don't, as schools have grouped together. If we look in France, historically there were about 7 academic departments. The average is now around 5. We're seeing that in other countries. So we're grouping disciplines together to facilitate the management structure of faculty on a day-to-day basis. But in terms of looking at quality, even within those departments, if I take my example, the peer review team within those departments wanted to look at the faculty intellectual contributions in those disciplinary areas because they are so different. You know, you can't put chalk and cheese together. You can from an organizational point of view, but not in terms of academic quality, because we could run the risk of having all your essays in supply chain and then no essays anywhere else. So this would be tricky.
It's always about going back to first principles. What is the intellectual capital that would reasonably be expected to drive what you're doing in your school? And then how do you report on that?
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, we have one more question asking for clarification from Tatiana. And she's wondering, so if one has a general business and management degree and a more focused degree, do we need to create both general and more focused disciplines?
My guess would be that you will cover the requirements for the general degree within the focused disciplines, because if it's a bit like the accounting and finance example. If you've got a degree in accounting and finance, but you also have an accounting degree and a finance degree, then you would have separate disciplines, and the faculty within those disciplines obviously support the accounting and finance combined. I would have thought here that the faculty in the focused discipline areas are probably the same faculty that are driving the more general degree. So therefore there wouldn't be a need to create this additional department or additional discipline as such. Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I agree. No, totally agree.
Perfect. Then we have time for maybe one last question, and there's a question wondering about
there's a few questions in the Q&A as well. Yeah, I think you probably picked up. Yeah.
And there was a question on data management, and we have an anonymous question asking, what do we have to consider in terms of the changes in how we capture data and what data to capture? Is there anything we need to be aware of here?
Okay, I'll jump in here first, because this is one I answered last week as well. I've said that one of the typical jobs QED does when it goes into schools is it does gap analysis. And I've said, I would say 95% of the schools we go into, data can be an issue in an early stage. And I would say that every school needs to have a solid data system before it does any of the accreditations. AACSB is the most data heavy, but they all have their own data requirements and data needs. You cannot do this you just need to have a really solid data system. You need to talk, if it's an off-the-shelf system such as Academ would have, you need to talk to your data provider. So I know, for example, that the off-the-shelf systems are working on updates to adapt to allow the reporting by discipline. I think Academ's is due out before Christmas from memory, but you can respond to that, Axel, directly. But either way, you need to have a solid data system. This is not something that schools can do off Excel, for want of a better phrase, consistently, time after time after time, with the requisite level of analysis and changing things around and going by degree program versus location, versus mode versus discipline versus school level, unless you're a very, very small school. And I say very small, I mean 1 degree program type school. Sarah, do you want to add anything?
I would add to that. I think it's a critical question when you start. When schools embark on an accreditation journey, they're often looking for just a way of doing it.
Yeah.
As I always say, you're opening a door for the next 300 years. So plan how you want to map that next 300 years. Ways of facilitating the systems that can give you simulation, scenario planning opportunities, and that the good old paper and pen mode, and I was resolutely pre-electricity in another life, information technology can help to go much faster. So really think about how you structure it. Don't think of it as a one shot. It's a process for the next 300 years. So build it so that you can work in that way, and have all the flexibility then to review as our strategies evolve, as our missions change, as the market positioning of the school changes. We need to be able to adapt and adjust as we go along. And so data system, whatever system you choose, will give you that flexibility to transition as smoothly as possible, rather than to have a revolution.
And I would just add the point that Frank made last week. He said that, you know, a lot of schools are struggling because they may have institutional led systems where they've been told that they must stay with those. And if that's the case, then, well, one thing is you need to have very clear conversations with your institution around that and what that means. And when standards change, it means institutional systems have to adapt to allow for the additional flexibility, etc. And sometimes it's easier just to have a dedicated system for this type of area, because things can change. And that does involve transition and getting systems to talk to each other completely. And there is quite a tortuous, you know, period of integration, as anybody who's been through it will know. And Axel is trying not to flinch on his side of the camera, because I know they've been through it with schools and academic, as has every other provider. But whatever you do, it needs to be systematic and it needs to be flexible and allow for changes, whether that's driven by the accreditation bodies or driven by changes, as Sarah said, within your own school.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, the two of you. And I think, Sarah, you've given us a great idea for another webinar where we talk about what AACSB might look like in 300 years then.
I'd just like to say I won't be around, but I'd love to take part in it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, Joanne. It's been a pleasure, and I hope this was valuable to our viewers. If any of your questions have not been answered due to the time restraints, please post them under the YouTube video once that's being posted, or email us anytime. Next week, we have the final webinar of the series where we'll focus on assurance of learning. As we had viewers from all time zones, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Thanks a lot, and thanks again, Sarah and Joanne.
And thanks to all the participants for being there.
And anybody who wants that link to the AACSB tips and trends, if you email me directly, I'll send that on to you.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.